My brother. We're going to be continuing in our series through Acts, and we're going to be in chapter 16 today. If you'd like to join me over there. I'm introduced to a very interesting family, and I want to dive into their kind of backstory a little bit with the details that we have that we can piece together. I think you'll find it interesting, and then we'll make some applications and lessons from that. And you also, if you're here in the 9 o'clock hour, hopefully you'll see some similar themes come to light between this and what we studied about Joshua and the people crossing the Jordan River in that lesson. Last week we were in chapter 15, and you might recall in chapter 15 of Acts that Paul had gone on a return from a missionary journey. Everything was good, except where all these Gentiles had been converted. Some of the Jews were saying, well, those folks need to be circumcised, remember? And it caused a big argument. Paul and Barnabas went down to Jerusalem and met with the elders and apostles. They had a discussion, and they resolved the problem peacefully. And they decided that, no, the Gentiles don't have to be converted and keep the law of Moses when they become Christians. And so they sent a letter out to let them know this. We see in chapter 15, verse 30, that after they had delivered this letter, it says, when they were sent off, they went down to Antioch. Having gathered the congregation together, they delivered the letter. And when they read it, they rejoiced because of its encouragement. They had started at Antioch. Let me go ahead and just get the map up here. So they had started at Antioch, and you'll recall in their first missionary journey, they sailed to Cyprus, across to here, and up through this Antioch of Pisidia, down through Lystra, where they were stoned, where Paul was stoned, Derbe, back to Lystra and around. And then when this argument came up about the role of circumcision in the law of Moses in the Gentiles, they traveled down to Jerusalem and, well, I don't even see it now, in Judea here. And it should be right there. This map, by the way, it's just very clear, but the city names are not always the ones I need to see. So anyway, they come back to Antioch, and they return with this letter saying Gentiles don't have to be converted or don't have to be circumcised, and everybody's happy. Now, at the next section, they decide to return and visit the churches. And you see that in verse 36 of chapter 15. Paul says to Barnabas, let's go back. Let's go back where we were and encourage those brothers in those churches. And this leads to this disagreement between Paul and Barnabas over taking John Mark with them. Evan talked about that in a recent lesson, so I'm not going to stay on that point. I'm going to just kind of skip over that. But Paul and Barnabas can't agree on whether or not to take this John Mark with them, so they split ways. In verse 40, it says, Paul chose Silas and departed, having been commended by the brothers to the grace of the Lord. He went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. So interestingly, when they split up, Barnabas takes John Mark and sails to Cyprus. This was the way that Paul and Barnabas had started out the first time they left. And so Barnabas takes John Mark. They sail this way. It says Paul went through Syria. So they literally, it seems like, went in opposite directions as they left the church there. But Paul goes through Syria and Cilicia and comes up to Derbe this way. So he's going to end up in the same place where they stopped the last journey, but he's taking the overland route instead of this across the sea route. So whereas Barnabas is sailing this way, Paul goes that way, but he's back here to Derbe, which is kind of where they left off in their first missionary journey. We see that in chapter 16, and we're getting closer to meeting Timothy. So chapter 16, verse 1, let's just read through verse 5, and then we're going to back up and think through this and think through kind of Timothy's backstory. So verse 1 of chapter 16, Paul also came to Derbe and to Lystra. A disciple was there named Timothy, the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer, but his father was a Greek. He was well spoken of by the brothers at Lystra and Iconium. Paul wanted Timothy to accompany him, and he took him and circumcised him because of the Jews who were in those places, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. And as they went on their way through the cities, they delivered to them for observation the decisions that had been reached by the apostles and elders who were in Jerusalem. So the churches were strengthened in the faith, and they increased in numbers daily. So it's very, very interesting here as we're reading this. Paul is still carrying this letter that he got from that meeting in Jerusalem. where at the conclusion of their meeting, they said, let's write a letter. And this letter will say that we're all on the same page, that Gentiles are not required to be circumcised, but they do need to abstain from blood, from things offered to idols, from sexual immorality. There are some things they need to do, but they don't need to be circumcised. So Paul's got that letter. And now as he goes back to the churches where they had already been established, he's bringing this letter with him, and he's letting them know that, look, we're all in the same page here because this false teaching was spreading around. You don't have to be circumcised. Meanwhile, as he does that, he meets this young man and he takes him and circumcises him. So as you're reading it, it almost would be like that sound effect where the record arm goes, off of the, it's like, what's going on? As he's in the very act of going around and letting everybody know circumcision is not required for the Gentiles, he takes Timothy and circumcises him. That's a very strange thing. And it says he did it because of the Jews. And it was the same Jews that Paul had stood up to and refused to submit to in previously. So what is going on here? Why is this happening? Why does Paul take Timothy and circumcise him? Well, to understand that, we have to dive into, there's just a handful of details, but when you think through what they mean, the story kind of comes to light and becomes clear, especially when we combine them with a couple of other details from other passages. So let's back up now and consider Timothy's complicated past. So first of all, we see that in verse 1, it was in Lystra where he meets him. And Lystra was the very place where Paul had been almost worshipped as a god and then stoned. But in that same city, he meets Timothy, and Timothy is already a Christian at this point. He is a disciple, we're told. And as we read about this, it says that his mother was Jewish and his father was Greek. So I'm going to add a couple more details as we try to fill in the background of Timothy. We find in a letter to Timothy, later, when Timothy becomes a preacher and he's out on his own, Paul is corresponding with him, and he writes to him and he says, I thank God whom I serve as did my ancestors with a clear conscience, as I remember you constantly in my prayers night and day. As I remember your tears, I long to see you that I may be filled with joy. I'm reminded of your sincere faith, a faith that dwelt first in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and now I am sure dwells in you as well. All right. So as we kind of piece this together, we see that Timothy's mother's name is Eunice, and she is a faithful Jewish person who had faith in God. His grandmother was Lois. She also had faith in God. Nothing is said about Lois's husband. So we don't know whether he was dead and not in the picture, or whether he was an unbeliever. We really don't know. Maybe he was an unfaithful Jew. There's no way to know for sure. But specifically, the mother and grandmother are singled out as being the spiritual source in this family, not the husbands. There's no mention of them. So let's go back in time and picture this. You've got Lois, a faithful Jewish woman, and she has a daughter, Eunice. And who knows if Lois's husband is helping in the raising of her or is a man of faith himself? We just don't know. We know that Lois was. As Eunice grows up, she turns into a young lady and she meets a man she wants to get married. But there's a problem. This man that she wants to marry is a Greek. And you recall in this particular city, of course, they worshiped Zeus and Hermes. We saw that in the lesson where they tried to worship Paul and Barnabas, thinking that they were the gods had come down to them. So you have this Greek person who no doubt worships the pantheon of the Greek gods, and that's who Lois's daughter Eunice wants to marry. And I'm sure it would have been a great cause of concern to Lois that this is who her daughter is going to marry. And not only a concern, but from what I understand, this was forbidden by the law of Moses. You can go back. There's a lot of text passages about this in the Old Testament. But in Deuteronomy, when they were going to go into the land, way back before the part where we were in Joshua, they were told, you shall not intermarry with them, the people of the land, giving your daughters to their sons, which is what Lois did, or taking their daughters for your sons. For they would turn away your sons from following me to serve other gods, and the anger of the Lord would be kindled against you, and he would destroy you quickly. But of course, as we know, the people kind of constantly did this. they were always tempted to intermarry, and the people of the land were regularly pulling them in their devotion away from God. There's an interesting example of this in the days of Nehemiah, and this passage is a little too long to fit on the screen. So if you would see if you can find the little book of Nehemiah in the books of history, and join me there at Nehemiah chapter 13. While you're finding it and turning there, I'll kind of bring us up to speed. In Nehemiah's day, the people were returning to the land from captivity in Babylon. And Nehemiah goes to visit them, and he finds when he gets there that the people were intermarrying again, which was, very upsetting to him that they had intermarried with these people of the land, the Gentiles, the unbelievers. So in Nehemiah 13, he has to deal with this, and he deals with it, and you can tell how big of a problem it was by how he deals with it. Beginning in verse 23 of Nehemiah 13. In those days also I saw the Jews who had married women of Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. Half their children spoke the language of Ashdod. They could not speak the language of Judah, but only the language of each people. And I confronted them, and I cursed them, and I beat some of them and pulled out their hair. And I made them take an oath in the name of God, saying, you shall not give your daughters to their sons, or take their daughters for your sons, for yourselves. Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin on account of such women? Among the many nations, there was no king like him. He was beloved by his God. God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, foreign women made even him to sin. Shall we then listen to you and do all this great evil and act treacherously against our God by marrying foreign women? So in this case, Nehemiah is saying he can't believe that they're falling into this sin. It was something that had been going on forever, but they were marrying with these people of the land so that half their kids, you couldn't even speak to them in the language of Judah. They only knew the language of the people around them. They didn't even speak the language anymore. And so he's really gets on to him. And it's kind of funny because in the realm of dealing with problems, beating and pulling out hair is on the table. But I don't know, we read this morning, there's a time for everything, Larry. And I don't know when the time for that would be. As far as this is how we're going to deal with this problem. But that's what Nehemiah did. So clearly it shows that was a very, very serious thing. There's other passages we can look at where this was a problem. It kind of comes up over and over in the Old Testament. So my guess is when Eunice decided to marry this Greek guy, this would have been a cause of great concern for Lois. Now, the next problem comes along when Eunice has a baby boy. And Eunice's baby boy is named Timothy. And on the 8th day, we all know what they're supposed to do, right? As faithful Jewish people, on the 8th day, you're supposed to have your little baby boy circumcised. But she did not have him circumcised because that's what Paul has to deal with when he gets there. So when Timothy was a child, he was not circumcised, but we know that this was a big problem, and we know how important it was. If you go to Genesis chapter 17, let's go to Genesis 17. In verse 9, just to emphasize the importance of this circumcision for the Jewish people. This is to Abraham, the father of all the Jews. Genesis 17, verse 9, God said to Abraham, as for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your offspring after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your offspring after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. You shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskins. It shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you. He who is 8 days old among you shall be circumcised, every male throughout your generations. And in verse 14 says, any uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. So this would have been a big issue for anybody in one of these mixed marriages where you have a Jewish person married to an unbeliever, because what happens for one issue with that is the unbeliever going to pull them away to worship these false gods, and they're going to abandon the one true God to start worshiping idols or Zeus or whatever. The other thing happens when they have kids. What is their faith going to be? Are they going to be part of the covenant of God? Are they going to be raised as children of Israel? Or are they going to learn to speak Ashdod and be raised like the people of the world? But that conflict would start on almost day number 8, when it's like, okay, we have a little baby boy. The God of Israel says he needs to be circumcised. Well, if you are not a believer in that God, you might say, no, we're not doing that. You're not going to cut my kid. You're not going to do this thing to the baby. I'm not going to go along with that. And in fact, this actually happened to Moses. I don't know if you remember this, but turn to Exodus chapter 4. Moses himself experienced this very problem. Actually, we'll start in chapter 2. Moses, you'll remember when he ran away after he struck down the Egyptian, and he ran away. And as he did, he came up to a well and he met some ladies there, and he shooed away some guys who were pestering him. And he was welcomed in. These people were from Midian. And verse 21 of chapter 2 of Exodus says, Moses was content to dwell with the man, and he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah. So now Zipporah is a Midianite. And she gave birth to a son and called his name Gershom. For he said, I have been a sojourner in a foreign land. So Moses is living in a foreign land. He's married a foreign woman. They've had a son named Gershom, right? All well and good, except later, turn over to chapter 4. So what's happening here is God has already appeared to Moses. He's already told him to go tell Pharaoh, let my people go. All that stuff's going on. And in the middle of all this, all of a sudden, Moses finds himself in trouble. In chapter 4, in verse 24, it says, at a lodging place on the way, the Lord met him and sought to put him to death. Then Zipporah took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin and touched Moses' feet with it and said, surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me. So he let him alone, and it was then that she said, a bridegroom of blood because of the circumcision. Whew. You can tell when you read that this brought to surface this underlying tension that had been there. When Gershom was born, he had not been circumcised as he should have been. And then at some point later, Moses is being stricken by God in some way. It's not clear how. And Zipporah knows what the problem is. There must have been some communication or something. But she goes and finally, whoever knows how old Gershom is at this point, but she circumcised him. She puts it at Moses' feet and she says, you are a bridegroom of blood. You can tell that she's not happy about this at all. She had probably been the reason why it hadn't been done to begin with, I would guess. She was not an Israelite. And so this same conflict, I'm sure, would come up over and over as people of Israel married people of the lands. What are they going to do about this issue of circumcision? So now we get back to our story, and you've got Timothy. His father's Greek. His mother's a Jew. He wasn't circumcised when he was a baby. Well, we see from Genesis 17, that means you would be cut off from the people. Some consequences of this would be, you would not be, if you were uncircumcised, you could not enter the sanctuary. I don't think he would be allowed to go into the temple area there, where the people were required on several times a year to appear and to worship God. As well, you would not be able to participate in the Passover. If a stranger sojourns with you and he keeps the Passover, let all his males be circumcised. Then he may come near and keep it, but he shall be as a native of the land. But no uncircumcised person shall eat of it. So if you imagine Eunice raising Timothy as a little boy, because his dad's Greek and Timothy's not been circumcised, he would not have been allowed to participate in many of the things that the Jewish people did. He would not have been able to go to their worship in the temple. He would not have been able to participate in the Passover because his father's Greek and he was not circumcised. And as we see in the passage, this was something everybody kind of knew about. So the community there in Lystra, where they lived, they would have been familiar with Eunice and Lois and Eunice and her husband, and the fact that they had this boy and he was never circumcised. And that was something that Timothy would have grown up basically, in a sense, kept outside of the community of the Jewish people there. In spite of that, we know that in the home, Lois and Eunice were sharing their faith with Timothy. So this is a very interesting picture. You've got this lady, Eunice. She's married to a Greek husband who's not a believer, and their son has not been circumcised, but she continues to teach him Even though he wasn't allowed to participate with the people of Israel, she was teaching him in the home. We know this because Paul says, your faith first dwelt in Lois, then Eunice, now you. And he also says in the same letter, as for you, continue in what you have learned and have firmly believed, knowing from whom you learned it, and how from childhood you've been acquainted with the sacred writings, which are able to make you wise for salvation through faith in Jesus, in Christ Jesus. So from a child, his mother had been teaching him the scriptures, which at this point would have been the Old Testament, of course. And so even though he was not really kind of welcomed by their community, I would say, his mother would have been teaching him at home about God. And so one day, if you recall, now we have the picture of this family in your mind, the grandma Lois, mother Eunice, Timothy, father's Greek, he's not circumcised. And one day, Paul comes to town, the first missionary journey. Paul and Barnabas come to town. They heal a man. Everybody starts shouting, and they want to offer sacrifice. They say, it's Zeus and Hermes. They've come to see us. Let's work. They said, no. Then they get the people stone him because the Jews come and turn their hearts against him. They stone Paul, drag him out of the city, leave him for dead. Yet God raised him up. He walks right back into town, and then he left the next day, and he comes back a few days later, encouraging the brethren. A church is founded, and Timothy is part of that number. And now, perhaps for the first time ever, he is welcomed by people of faith. He's part of this group. He's found a community. He's a Christian. He's a believer. He's a disciple. And everybody speaks well of him. Back in Acts chapter 16, let's go back and pick up our story now. In Acts chapter 16, we're told in verse 2, he was well spoken of by the brothers at Lystra and Iconium. So Timothy's like this really admired young man as a Christian. And when Paul comes along, in verse 3, it says Paul wanted Timothy to accompany him. He was really impressed with Timothy. He wants to invite him to go on the missionary journey. But he took him and circumcised him, which is very interesting. And it says, because of the Jews who were in those places, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. So in other words, everybody around there knew who Timothy was. And they all knew his family, and they all knew his dad, they all knew his mom, and they all knew that he had never been circumcised, and that he was. And so Paul recognizes this is going to be a problem. If you're going to go with us, and we're going to go to the synagogues, and we're going to teach, and we're going to do all that, then the fact that he had been basically apostate, or he'd been uncircumcised as a child, was going to get in the way of their mission and sharing the gospel. And so Paul takes him and circumcises him himself, which in a way would have been the father's job. So it's sort of like Paul becomes sort of like a father figure to him. And in fact, he calls Timothy his child in the faith in 1 Timothy 2. And the reason for that, I would suggest to you, is because Timothy had been a Jew. And so the issue that they had to solve in Acts 15 was, what about these Gentiles who are becoming Christians? Do they need to be circumcised? And the answer is no, they don't. But Timothy's problem is he had been raised in a Jewish family by a Jewish mother, and they had not kept the law. And this was well known to people, and that was going to be an issue, I would suggest to you. And so when Paul's writing to Corinth, he kind of explains his mindset when it comes to these things. He says, though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. To the Jews, I become as a Jew in order to win the Jews. To those under the law, I become as one under the law, not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law, I become as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. To the weak, I became weak, that I might win the weak. I become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. I do it for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessings. So what we see here is that Paul's attitude toward this is, if he's going to have the opportunity to share the gospel with people, he doesn't want anything to get in the way of that. He wants them to be able to hear him out. So when he's around the Jews, he knows how to behave in a way that they would welcome him and accept him. And so if you think about that, and you think about Timothy and the fact that Timothy's this shining young man with a lot of potential, and Paul wants to take him, but the whole place knows that he had never been circumcised, it was Paul's judgment, I would obviously assume that it would be best to take care of that, fix that problem, so that Timothy can be welcomed in as they go. Because remember, every town they go to, the first place they go is the synagogue. And the first thing they do is speak to the Jews and share with them the gospel. And then from there, if the Jews reject it, they turn their attention to the Gentiles. And so by taking care of this problem, it will remove an obstacle that might have been in the way for Paul and Timothy to do their work among the other Jews in that area. And I would suggest to you that that was the reason why Paul had him circumcised. We know in Galatians that Paul says he refused to have Titus circumcised, by the way. So you have these two kind of proteges, Timothy and Titus. Titus, not being a Jew, not raised as a Jew, a Gentile who became a Christian, even though people wanted him to be circumcised, Paul said, absolutely not. It never applied to him. He's not a Jew. He was never required to be circumcised, and that's not required to be a Christian. But for Timothy, who should have been circumcised when he was 8 days old, who was never, Paul felt it best to take care of that. So, very kind of complex little passage, interesting little family dynamics going on there. What kind of lessons can we learn from this? I would suggest to you two things to consider for ourselves. By the way, did you see the connections to the Joshua story? The themes there were the people had neglected to circumcise their kids, remember? So they crossed over and wait a minute, before we go any further. The same thing happened to Moses, right? He's in the middle of serving God, and he's like, hey, we're going to take care of this problem right now. And the people, before they could go any further, like, stop what you're doing. We got to address this problem. And that's really what Paul does with Timothy. And the second thing is, I love this example of his mother and grandmother passing their faith down, even in a kind of complicated family dynamic where everybody wasn't on the same page. She taught her little boy and she trained him up. And I think the same thing happened with Moses when he was a child. He grew up knowing who he was. We see the influence of his mother. Several other examples like that. Of course, Proverbs 22:6 says, train up a child in the way he should go. When he's old, he will not depart from it. And so much of that happens in the home. So much of that happens in the rocking chair. So much of that happens around the dinner table. And we talked about that in this morning's lesson as well. When you wake up, when you go to bed, when you're walking along, be talking to your children about the Lord. That was emphasized in the earlier hour. And we see here that Lois raised Eunice. And even though she married a Greek man, she was still a believer. She had faith. And Eunice had a son, Timothy. And even though his dad didn't go along with it, I would assume, him being circumcised, and probably did not contribute at all to his faith, it was contributed to his mother and his grandmother, that where his faith came from, and that he was taught from a child to know the scriptures. And so that's a great example for us. And we see that it really, Timothy turned out to be a wonderful young man. And then the other thing is, I think Paul shows us the importance of removing any kind of thing that would get in the way of being able to let our light shine. Anything that would get in the way of sharing the gospel with other people. We should be mindful of that. Let's turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 8. We're going to look at two scriptures about this. 1 Corinthians 8. He's talking here about people who are insisting on eating food that had been offered to idols, and they didn't really care what anybody else thought because they felt like they had the right to do it. And so he says in 1 Corinthians 8, beginning in verse 8, food will not commend us to God. We're no worse off if we do not eat, better off if we do. In other words, it doesn't matter. But take care that this right of yours does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak. For if anyone sees you who have knowledge eating in an idol's temple, and I think he's being kind of sarcastic there with that knowledge, will he not be encouraged if his conscience is weak to eat food offered to idols? And so by your knowledge, this weak one is destroyed, this brother for whom Christ died, thus sinning against your brothers and wounding their conscience when it's weak, you sin against Christ. Therefore, if food makes my brother stumble, I will never eat meat, lest I make my brother stumble. Paul's attitude is, look, yes, we have some freedoms. Yes, maybe you have every right in the world to do something, and there's nothing wrong with it. But be mindful, if by doing this thing, is that going to get in the way of the cause of Christ? If someone sees you doing whatever it is that you think to yourself, I have every right to do this, I'm going to do this thing. But could it be that other people will see your example and then they sin against their conscience, that they would be led to sin against Christ? And if so, he says, if you cause someone to sin by exercising your right, then you have sinned against Christ. The thing that wasn't wrong for you has now become wrong because it became a stumbling block and caused some weak person to sin and fall away. So we should never insist on doing whatever we want to do, regardless of how other people might be affected by that. Turn over to chapter 9. Chapter 9, verse 11 and 12. Paul applies this to himself. He says he uses himself as an example. And it's about he had foregone accepting support from them. In verse 11, he says, if we've sown spiritual things among you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? If others share this rightful claim on you, do not we even more? Nevertheless, we've not made use of this right, but we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. So you could say Paul put his money where his mouth is, because in his mind, it was his judgment. And I think a lot of this is Paul's judgment, but let's just look at where his heart was and what his attitude was. At his judgment, if he came to Corinth, a very wealthy town, and he taught the people the gospel, and he taught them that they need to support him, that could easily become a stumbling block as people would look at that and question maybe his motives or his intentions. And so instead, he says, while he was with them, he accepted support from elsewhere so he could work there, but he did not accept support from them. He had a right to, and he could have done it, but he didn't want to put a stumbling block. And so he was willing to pay the price himself to try to make sure that the gospel had the best chance it could to find receptive hearts, and that something wouldn't become an obstacle in that way. And I would suggest to you that that's exactly why he had Timothy circumcised as well, because he was about to join him as they travel around preaching. And why let this thing be an issue that would stand between them and being able to effectively teach and preach about faith in God? If you yourself, if they all know you never kept the law of God, you didn't follow the commandment when you were, how are you going to go and be an effective evangelist for the sake of the gospel? And so with that, I think as we consider our own lives, let's just question ourselves about how we conduct ourselves. Is there anything that I'm doing that would be a turnoff to people if I was going to share the gospel with them? Is there something that I'm engaged in? I'll tell you one that has occurred to me in the past few years. It's just my opinion. I'm just telling you what I think about it. I used to love to discuss politics. I grew up talking about it. I grew up listening to Rush Limbaugh on the radio, and it was like a big topic of conversation around the table, and it was a lot of fun to me for a long, long time. But I have noticed in the past few years, things have gotten so tense, and that discussing that sometimes brings out like very heated reactions from people. And the last thing I'd want to do is turn off somebody or make somebody not want to care what I think or listen to me because I've got really strong political opinions. It makes me think to myself, I need to be careful about that. And that's something that comes to my mind anyway. Would I want to let my thoughts about something like that turn off literally about half the population? And would that be helpful or hurtful if I then want to share with them the gospel of Christ? And so there's those kinds of things that I think we need to just think about and consider in our own lives. What can we do to give the gospel the best chance to let our light shine, to find receptive hearts? And even if that comes at some cost, giving up some liberty, paying some kind of price, that's what Paul was willing to do. That's what Timothy was willing to do. And I would suggest that's what we should be willing to do as well, if it would help the gospel be spread and the Lord's kingdom to grow. Perhaps there's someone here this morning who needs to give your life to the Lord. We're going to sing the song, Jesus, I Come, which is an invitation for you to come. If there's something you need to make right,